Steve Jobs once observed that if you're not willing to cannibalize your own business, someone else will do it for you. I mean, how true that is. Well, what a timely and relevant message for any business or brand or organization today. Because as the status quo continues to be disrupted at a greater rate than ever before, simply relying on what has led to success in the past will likely come at the cost of not just your future success, but potentially your future survival. You know, I've spent much of the last decade helping some of the world's biggest brands and organizations navigate change and stay ahead of the curve. And personally, I found it fascinating to examine brands and businesses that, in the midst of all this change and disruption, are going from strength to strength. But also, of course, looking at those brands and businesses that are having the opposite experience, that are falling prey to this time of upheaval. And the interesting thing I've found is that looking at any business or brand or organization and examining its relevance over time, it follows a cycle or a pattern that is incredibly consistent. Okay, if you look at, for instance, again, relevance over time, the pattern that is followed is a pattern that looks much like this, a classic bell curve shape, and it's one that's broken up into 4 different phases. Now, in the early stages of any new brand or business or organization or even a movement of people, typically in those early stages, relevance is pretty low because you're still trying to figure out who you are, but more importantly, who your target market is. I mean, it's pretty difficult to be relevant to a target market when you don't know who they are just yet. But of course, as time goes on and you become more deliberate, more strategic, your relevance gradually begins to grow. And if you keep doing the right things long enough, you reach the first trigger on this curve called the tipping point. And the tipping point, of course, is where you go from obscurity to prominence. Momentum starts to kick in. In fact, you really know when you're starting to rise up through the second phase here on the curve because your competitors will start to rip off your ideas. Now, when you get to the top of this second phase here, this is what Derek Zoolander would perhaps call the so hot right now stage. And this point where your relevance is high, where you're in a real sweet spot as a business. You've got huge momentum. It seems that everything you touch turns to gold. I mean, you're hitting your stride. This point here, while it's incredibly exciting, can I put it to you that the so hot right now stage is the most perilous, vulnerable, dangerous time for any business or brand or organization. Because when you're riding high and achieving awards and everyone's singing your praises, there's a massive temptation to become just a tiny bit complacent, even a little bit arrogant. A dynamic tends to unfold, which I call the intoxication of success. Beware the intoxication of success. Because what happens is when people get to this position and start reading their own press and, I guess, succumbing to this notion of invincibility, we're so big, so successful, we could never fail, we could never fall. What tends to happen is instead of reinventing themselves while they're at the top, they start to rest on their laurels. And if you do this long enough, you will pass the second trigger on this curve as you drift. And this second trigger here is called the turning point. And the turning point is like your peak relevance. And I tell you, you will know the second you've passed the turning point in the business. Because there'll be this internal gnawing sense that effortless momentum you used to have just sort of isn't there anymore. You know, you're doing all the same sort of things, but now it just feels like dull drudgery. In fact, many businesses describe this early part of phase 3 as a time where they feel like they've lost their mojo. What tends to happen is most leaders and organizations, though, they enter a phase called denial. And they just continue with business as usual, assuming if they just keep doing what they've always done, they'll keep getting what they've always got until there's a point. Normally this point is somewhere around here. It's a point that we call crisis. And this is when the writing on the wall becomes very clear. You're not as hot as you used to be. You know, at first you have a bad month, then it's a bad quarter, then it's a bad year, then suddenly you've had a bad decade. And in fact, some of those players, those competitors who were down here while you were up the top, now they're the ones in the so hot right now zone. And this point of crisis can be absolutely terrifying, but it can be a gift. A crisis truly is a terrible thing to waste in business. The old adage is so true. Necessity is a mother of invention. When times get tough and the wheels fall off, it's amazing how clever we become as human beings, how creative we can actually be. And if at this point here, at the point of crisis, you play your cards right, you can actually turn this around and start regaining relevance. And this point of reinvention is absolutely critical. But if, of course, you play your cards wrong or do the wrong thing, you will continue on this downward slide past the third and final trigger on this curve called the tanking point, and eventually you become completely and utterly obsolete. Now, you look at Kodak, for instance, and they took 131 years to go through this cycle. Atari took roughly 23 years. MySpace took about 9 years. But regardless of how this cycle plays itself out, there's one stage which I find absolutely fascinating to look at in any business or brand or organization, and it's this point here. It's the point of reinvention. And the focus of the coming 5 videos will be to look at strategies and examples of brands and businesses, organizations that have got to this crisis point and turned things around and started regaining relevance, that have reinvented themselves at that critical point. But you know, more importantly, we're going to look at some examples of brands and organizations that haven't waited till their hand was forced, but have reinvented themselves while they're still up the top. And that is really a smart way to be, because that's when you're operating out of strategy rather than survival. And that's going to be the focus of the coming 5 videos. But before we finish this first video clip, perhaps you're wondering where you are on this curve right now. One of the things we've done recently is develop a diagnostic designed to help a brand or a business figure out where they are on this curve. And you're welcome to have a look at that diagnostic. In fact, the website for it is mysilentpulse.com. Because every business has multiple pulses. Your audible pulse measures the tangible financial aspects of your business. Your silent pulse measures your relevance, where you are on this curve. So feel free to check that out before you look at the next video clip, mysilentpulse.com. You may well be surprised at what you find.